I'm Nathan Giede.
And I'm Aaron Ekman.
From BC's northern capital.
Welcome to the Ram and Stag Show.
2021 is a big year for British Columbians. This summer marks 150 years since we joined Canada. We celebrate this on BC Day with camping trips, family barbecues, and of course, locally crafted beverages. But due to the pandemic, it's unlikely our 150th birthday will be properly saluted. Perhaps that's just as well, because even 150 years later, answers to the questions, what does it mean to be a British Columbian, and is Confederation still good for us, have zero consistency. Imagine for a moment we went back to normal just in time to plan for our 150th birthday, and suppose that you have been appointed the chairman of the Provincial Planning Committee. You are in charge of picking from the nominees put forward across the province for your team. And after the team has assembled, you will be in charge of helping them plan all BC-wide events, as well as develop the pageantry, branding, mascot, official coins and medals, etc. Who's on your team? Our provincial government declares there are 8 distinct regions in British Columbia, but within those, there are over 150 municipalities and 200 Indian bands. More than half of our population lives in a 100-mile radius right next to the U.S. border, yet within that population are distinct peoples that each have a unique story, not to mention that the rest of the province often feels overpowered by said cosmopolitans. How many seats does each stakeholder have a right to on your committee? Even if perfect representation is achieved, now the committee must begin the huge job of picking what aspects of British Columbia ought to be highlighted. There are models for this already. In 2010, we had the Vancouver Olympics, and only a few years ago, we had Canada's sesquicentennial. But this isn't an outward display to the world for the most part. Our 150th would be all but a private party, the vast majority of viewers and participants being residents of the most beautiful place on earth. Well, save for that slogan, which we see on every license plate, which is only ever denied, ironically, where would there be any consensus on British Columbia's story, and therefore the values as well as ideas that ought to be represented in our decorations, symbols, and pageantry for the 150th? Whichever way you turn, there is a disagreement regarding our past, our present, and our future, as well as our heritage and culture, as well as our place in Canadian Confederation, even our current name throughout all of British Columbia. First Contact, Explorers of BC's Interior, Gold in the Caribou, the Union of the Colonies, the building of the CPR, John A. Macdonald, Amor de Cosmos, the Chilcotin Boys, Judge Begbie. These are just a few historical events as well as persons that earn drastically different reactions and readings from us based on our background or beliefs. Attempts to focus only on material achievements will also raise objections about the legacy of the oligarchs versus the labor that they used to get to their ends that runs throughout our history. Even our present triumphs over logistical challenges presented by our difficult terrain via roads, dams, or pipelines inspire awe as well as complete disgust, depending on who you're talking to. And what if your team attempts to look to the future for symbols to celebrate today? Social progress mean 2 very different things in West Vancouver and Vanderhoof. At least 3 generations are deeply divided on how rising costs of living will be mitigated. And development versus preservation is an endless discussion amongst all our citizens of every stripe, class, and creed. You might be wondering, what's the point of this thought experiment? Simply to show you that because of regional, cultural, historical, and political divides, let alone many others, a monolithic, single, clear narrative about what it means to be a British Columbian is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. Thus, the fundamental question of our identity, and therefore where we ought to go as a province with regards to Confederation, cannot be properly answered at this present time. I'm assuming you wouldn't wish the chairmanship, the committee, and the tasks that I've described on your worst enemy. But the truth is, we're all on this team in some capacity. And in the 150th year since we became a province of Canada, we owe ourselves a sense of identity and direction.
Well, that's such a good summary, I think, of really what the show is about, and that's why it's such a great opening for this show. I've always sort of wondered myself, Nathan, and it'd be interesting to get your take on it. British Columbians, Canada Day is a big event in BC, and most people probably couldn't tell you when BC Day is, unless they happen to, be able to enjoy the stat holiday. But there isn't the same kind of pageantry. There isn't the same celebration. There certainly isn't the same kind of money spent. Why is that? I wonder. Why is it? I've always kind of wondered, because I've always thought of myself in terms of, how the groups that you identify with. I always start with the local and expand from there. So you start with your family, and then you expand it to your neighborhood, to your town, to your province, to your country, and the loyalty sort of goes in that direction. That always seemed kind of normal to me. But yet, for the majority of British Columbians, there seems like there's this loyalty to the national brand first, and a distant second is the province. And what you've done here, I think, is outline a lot of the reasons why that's the case: the fragmentation in the province, the history of it. And that's really what the show is about, I think, is to try to, is for us coming from different ends of the political spectrum to try to examine why that is, and to have these conversations about what British Columbian identity is. Is it a bad thing to even talk about it? I'm sure we'll find out. But I think you've summarized all that quite well.
I think we're definitely going to hear about it in the very near future. Why doesn't BC Day get the same recognition as Canada Day? It's a difficult question. I think part of it, in a sense, is maybe BC Day has kind of gained some of the aura of other sort of nouveau riche sort of holidays, in the sense like it's just another long weekend. So that's the way it's understood. It's like, well, that's August long weekend. It's like it's better than in July, because July it's too hot, and in August like the bugs are starting to die off, and like it's a great time to go camping. And I mean that's the way it's kind of understood. It's more of it's almost like a suburban family understanding, or maybe even a bit of some of that fraternity or sorority understanding about it. It's not understood in the same kind of colonial pageantry of, say, Dominion Day, where you could go to Barkerville and you have Dominion Day, right? You can wander around and people are drinking tea, and it's this very hoity-toity thing. But BC Day is just, well, I mean, it's August long weekend. Everyone loves August long weekend, but do they connect it with our identity? You're probably right. Probably not very much.
Well, it's interesting you raised the Dominion Day celebrations at Barkerville. If you haven't been, you need to go. I mean, it's quite an event. They have a lot of actors on, full-time actors that are attached to the facility that sort of act out the different conversations and debates that were taking place at the time. Yeah. And what I've always enjoyed about the presentation that they give at Barkerville in particular on the Dominion Day ceremonies is that they remake all of these debates that were taking place between Americans and the Loyalists in British Columbia at the time. And of course, back in 1871, 1872, over 50% of non-Indigenous people in British Columbia were American. They had American citizenship. And we even mentioned yesterday that our second premier, Amor de Cosmos, born in California, had American citizenship, ended up getting it changed. But they play out all of these debates that were going on between British Columbians about whether they should join Confederation or whether they should sort of wait for the American annexation that clearly would have made its way up here eventually. And so it really leads me, your comments have led me to think, well, what is it about Canada Day that is so important to us? There's no question really why Americans celebrate July 4th. That's clear. It was a culmination of basically a revolution where they completely changed their political system, extracted themselves from the monarchical system and decided to go with the republic and a democratic one at that. We don't have that history. In that context, we were hastily trying to slap together some kind of a brand that spanned from east to west, from ocean to ocean. For two, we may disagree on the two factors that are raised. The first one I think we can agree on. It was to stop the American annexation.
That's correct.
Right?
I would say that's a fair point.
And the second point, which we may not agree on, and certainly from the perspective of the Indigenous people that were here at the time, the Confederation was slapped together also as a vehicle with which to subjugate the Indigenous peoples that were here already, and the outcome of which was really the violation of so many of the treaties that had been signed, especially in British Columbia. And so, with that history in mind, it isn't. I mean, it's understandable to me that we don't really celebrate BC Day to the same extent, but I'm not even really sure why we celebrate Canada Day. We don't have that same history of revolution. We didn't have that defining moment of coming into our own as a nation with our own principles and our own system of governance. It really was just in reaction to what was coming south of the border. And in terms of the decision that was ultimately made in British Columbia to join Confederation, I'd argue collectively there wasn't like a whole bunch of, like, the vast majority of British Columbians all came together and said, we have to join Canada because that's the set of principles. No, we wanted to, they offered to build us a railway to get the things that we needed to sell across the country. The Americans weren't going to do that. They were kind of busy with other things.
They were very busy.
Yeah, and so we took the best deal at the time. And really in that context, BC, the history of BC is one of kind of a big company town. Like it was literally forged in a non-Indigenous way by colonialists who were part of a corporation. Hudson's Bay Company, of course, didn't come from British Columbia, but was competing with the other trading companies out here. And as you get into the 1900s, you start to get into some of the coal extraction, et cetera. You get Dunsmuir and that. I mean, entire company towns. I mean, the whole province just littered with all these company towns. Mm-hmm. And so how do you
explain how there's all these roads into the middle of nowhere in this province?
Right. And so many, like, there's more ghost towns in British Columbia than probably anywhere else in North America. Like, it's quite astounding. Bill Barley used to chronicle this stuff. If you haven't watched his episodes, they're all on YouTube now. You can go through, what was it, Ghost Trails and
that's right. Yeah.
Just a treasure trove of amazing BC history. He's such a loss. But you can sort of see why we've never developed this sort of cultural identity as a people. Plus, we've got all the same divisions. But are the divisions in British Columbia, Indigenous versus not, whether or not we've honored the treaties that we signed, that our ancestors signed with Indigenous peoples, is that a total block against us developing that kind of cultural identity? I mean, you could argue that the same division obviously exists in the U.S. and has for just as long. There were Indigenous populations that were pushed aside in the States, arguably more a violent and totalitarian fashion that was even happening in Canada. And then, of course, there's the whole slave thing. So
kind of a thing.
Yeah, which, sort of permeates their culture today. And yet, if you go up to a Black American and they're not questioning their own identity in the United States. I mean, their struggle has been to assert their identity as Americans to the same extent that white folks have, I think. I think that's fair. But if you were to talk to an Indigenous person in British Columbia, you might not get the same insistence that, I identify as a British Columbian the same as you do. In fact, you could probably talk to a number of British Columbians who probably don't really identify as British Columbians, whether they were born here or not. They're just kind of, well, I'm Canadian and I'm from Vancouver, but you don't see anybody really like, I'm proud to be a British Columbian kind of thing.
I think part of it is that we have to understand that Canada Day went through a very serious rebrand, right? It went through a huge rebrand at our centennial, right? At our 100th. That was a big part of it. Without that rebrand, which effectively was the Pearson and Trudeau consensus, essentially manufacturing what was left of Canada into, the Liberal Party of Canada's values are Canadian values. And what is that? Well, it's essentially what's playing well in Montreal and Toronto, with little homages to other little metropolitan centers that we did have around. And it was all rolled together into the mosaic. We got rid of the red ensign. We brought in the Pearson pennant, as Stephen Baker liked to call it. We brought in the maple leaf, right? We have, the Canadian national anthem was promoted in a big way. This is what happened, right? And in a way, the Liberal Party of Canada, I would argue, essentially has been running the show ever since. They clearly decide what is and isn't Canadian values. They dictate the narrative. They do this through the CBC. They do this everywhere. Now, we can get into that whole debate another time, but the point that we need to draw for this episode is there was a serious rebrand, and that rebrand and the exportation of that rebrand, and then the way that it effectively kind of colonized everything else, like any other metropolitan center in Canada effectively is trying to ape Toronto, right? Or Montreal. And that's what's happening. And we can see that even in Expo. We had Expo 67, right? And then we had Expo 86, which is something that really shaped Vancouver forever, right? And so that's what I think is kind of happening there. So Canada Day has a distinct flavor to it. Even here in downtown Prince George, right? Canada Day has everybody brings out their pavilion, and they have their little market to sell their particular ethnic food and their political or not necessarily political cause, but their particular nonprofit, their particular thing. So we have all these really effectively tribes. We have tribes with their pavilions, right? And they're all selling their thing and doing their thing under the banner of there's the maple leaf up there. There's like 600 flags down at I guess it was Fort George Parks now. I think Clayton Tenay Park. But the thing is that downtown, there's like 600 flags, but there is at least one Canadian flag flapping around somewhere, and that's the rebrand. And so, like, for British Columbia, what's that going to look like? Do we need to have a BC Day where every single, municipality's flag or the local flags of the First Nations are coming together? That's the symbolism. I don't know what it is, but there has to be effectively a rebrand, because right now what you have with August Long Weekend is just that. It's August Long Weekend. People might not even know that it's called BC Day.
Right. And in fact, it is, I think, commonly referred to as August Long Weekend, not BC Day. But again, I mean, that fundamental, if you compare sort of, if we're, for lack of a better term, patriotism in the U.S. versus Canada, on one, like, I don't want to oversell the importance of patriotism. There's some dangers in overt patriotism, I think. We've seen that throughout history, but it can't all be bad, because in order for any society to continue and to succeed, and from my perspective, to be able to extend wealth in the most efficient way possible across the population without it bulking up in small corners somewhere with a whole bunch left with nothing, you have to have some agreement on some principles, particularly political ones and some philosophical ones. And the Americans, I think, have that. They've done a better job of achieving that than we have, and a lot. It's not just because they're better at it than we are; it's because of their history. So they can always go back to the founding documents, to the Federalist Papers. They can agree on the basic building blocks of their society, which is spelled out in their Constitution and was debated vociferously amongst the states, the founding states, when they were fighting the British, essentially to try to extract themselves, as many other countries around the world did so as well before and after that happened. And so when you go through a history like that, you forge this national identity that generations in advance down the road can keep referring to. In Canada, we haven't even had our flag. We've only had it since the 60s, I think, right? Like it's quite a new thing. And it really is this sort of amorphous, I don't even know what it is. It looks like something that was really developed by committee and just sort of adopted. I mean, I understand that the two red bars are supposed to represent the oceans, and I don't really know what the leaf represents, to be perfectly honest. I know what the American flag represents, and I know what it represents to them. It represents freedom and independence. And for us, it's just kind of like, we decided we wanted to remain British subjects to some degree, and then down the road we ended up getting some constitutional autonomy from them. But there's nothing that sort of binds us together other than just this brand, which is no different than, tell me what the difference is between the Canadian brand versus iPhone. And which of those two brands do you think the highest number of Canadians show real allegiance?
Well, this is a fair question. This is a fair question. I think the thing though is that, again, you come back to this fundamental idea of like what is Canada or what's happening with Canada. I think though there was an identity in Canada. I mean, if you go and ask, like, I'm sorry to put it this way, but it honestly, you have to ask old timers at this point for the most part, because they were the ones still raised in that time. If you ask older folks about this, they can tell you that the educational system and the cultural identity, even here in British Columbia, had some clear lines in it, and a lot of it had to do with Confederation and, yes, what we call now colonial modes of political existence, and even the idea of loyalty to crown and country and that sort of thing. But so much of that had to be discarded, and it had to be discarded, again, if we go back to what happened under Pearson and Trudeau the first, to be clear, is that they had to discard it because that Tory loyalist understanding, which also then in the French world would have been, that is to say the Quebecois world, would have been the ultramontane understanding, a very traditionalist Catholic understanding. It had to be gotten rid of, because otherwise the pivot, the rebrand, the new Canada they were trying to build, they would have been ruined, right? Eventually, those old belongings, those old mindsets, kind of waspy Toryism in Ontario, ultramontane Catholicism in Quebec, maritime belonging that still exists, but of course has been politically overrun because the West has outgrown it, and so has Ontario and Quebec. They've completely outrun them in when it comes to amount of MPs and that sort of thing. And all those pieces, they had to be kind of either just neutered or disqualified or effectively forgotten. Right? How many people are even taught about Vimy Ridge? How many people are taught about Dunsmuir Castle here in BC? How many people are taught these things? And I'm not just saying that they have to be done in a perfectly monolithic way. I'm saying that like how many people are even introduced to these concepts? And that's where I think things get very. I think you have a line to pull on there. That's what went sideways when it comes to British Columbian identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I'm excited going forward to sort of examine some of these questions. And again, I really appreciate your opening on this because you've summarized them so well. And there's a whole number of different folks across the province I think that we'll talk to over the many years that we undertake this journey. But what's interesting to me is sort of in the absence of any identifiable unifying culture, like how do you describe a British Columbian? Because many outside and internal observers have described us over the years as just kind of part of Lotus Land, and it's and the prevalence and the volume of the amount of marijuana produced in this country hasn't really taken away from that image. I think we have how others perceive us as just sort of being like, they're way out, they're like the real West, even more West, so West that they're even more laid back than Albertans are. It should be a bit of a joke because Albertans aren't very, very laid back, but I mean, like there's this interesting schism, I think, in British Columbia of conservative politics in some areas of the province, like hyper-conservative politics, if you want to go to the Northeast, Peace River, et cetera, versus this kind of what which an apt description of sort of Lotus Land in the Lower Mainland, et cetera. But the common thread between all of us is, as far as the rest of the country is concerned, I think we all kind of agree that, if you're from outside of BC, like give us 2 weeks heads up before you bother crossing the Rockies, okay? Because we've got our own thing going on over here. We, as you say quite often, just want to be left alone. Like things are pretty good here. But the challenge of that, of course, is the economy of the province being as dominated and filled for so many years by so many foreign interests, et cetera. And where with the lack of a common cultural identity that spans race, that transcends religion, atheism, whatever, the things that generally divide people. In the absence of that, there isn't really a coherent resistance to the foreign expropriation of our resources, and the degree to which the wealth derived from those resources travel outside of the province, and the negative effect that has on our economy. And so that's why I'm interested in talking about it, whatever it means. However angry people might get that we want to go down this sort of what they might term a nationalistic road of identifying what British Columbia actually means to the most number of people, there's consequences to not doing it, I think, and that's why I'm really excited to go down this journey with you.
No, I'm super excited to do this as well, because I think that's exactly what needs to be explored. Because ultimately, just as you said, right, we have ourselves, we have our family, we have our our community, finally our municipality or region, and of course then our province and out to Canada. And I mean, I think we feel very disconnected from Ottawa a lot of the time. I think we feel disconnected even from Alberta. We just don't, like, Albertans and British Columbians don't see eye to eye on a lot of things, and we are surrounded by the Americans and on at least two sides. It's time for us as a province and as a people, regardless of race, class, or creed, to decide how are we going to move forward and create. Yes, it is called the most beautiful place on earth. Now we have to live up to that and make it the best place on earth.
Well, that's just such a great way to put it. So thanks very much for taking us starting us off down this road. Our next episode is going to be on the topic of travel bans in British Columbia versus interprovincial travel bans. So stick with us for that, and thanks for listening.
Absolutely.